The Darkangel Chapter 11. Return. Iriel walked, swiftly, determinedly. She padded over the coarse, crusted sand. Her desert staff made a soft, scrunching sound as its tapered heel bit into the sand. She walked until the sun had fallen 4 degrees in the heavens, and when she could step no further, she let her knees buckle and lay face down in the trough between 2 dunes. Sleep enveloped her at once, and she dreamed of the Darkangel. She saw him snapping the bone of a bat's wing between his teeth while telling her, "You are even more sport to bait than these." Iriel felt a sharp pang from the scar on her neck, and she stirred in her sleep. In her dreams, she heard the Durra's voice crying, "Haste, daughter, and find the Avaclon," though she herself protested, "I have not yet said that I shall help you." Hollow-eyed, the wraiths drifted before her, moaning, "Iriel, Iriel will not help us." She heard her own voice cry out, "Edwin! Which one of you is Edwin?" Then she heard the gargoyles howling and rattling their chains, as Oratoto assured her, "Peace, little pale one, everyone is free." And the pendulum whispered, "I cannot bear you any further. You must go on alone." Iriel awoke with a start, to find herself lying alone in the empty desert. Solstar hung barely 5 degrees from setting. The forward edge of one drifting dune had eased gently over her feet and legs. She shoved herself to her knees and hastily battered away the soft weight of sand. Only then did she realize she was shivering. Her bones felt cold, her muscles ached. She chafed her chill limbs stiffly a moment and wondered if the vampire would strangle her the moment she returned. Then she chewed a little of the food from her pouch, though she had no stomach for it. She struggled to her feet and started off again. It was not until many hours later, too late to retrace her steps, that she realized she had left the walking stick behind. She reached the borderland just as Solstar touched the east horizon. She halted on the last sandy down slope, leaned back against the crusted dune side a few minutes to rest. Beyond lay the loose grey soil and scrub of the wasteland bordering the plains. The sun on her left was already half hidden behind the eastern steeps by the time she roused herself. Solstar gradually slipped behind the mountains, and the grey scrubland turned black. Iriel walked on through the pale earthshine. The great star had been a long time set before she allowed herself again to rest. The stars wheeled, slowly, halfway round the sky. The planet waxed earth blue towards midnight and gradually waned, and the wound on her forearm mended in a long pale scar. The fortnight passed. Iriel trudged and rested, ate, slept, then arose again and continued on, always south. Visions of the Darkangel invaded her dreams. It was in the grey dark before dawn that Iriel first made out the Icarus's castle. Mounted on its mounting jutting up from the plain, she made for it steadily, more numb than afraid, and by the time Solstar had risen, she had reached the cliff's foot. The gargoyles spotted her as the light grew bright enough. They began wailing horribly as they'd wailed when the Darkangel had first brought her to the keep. They sounded starved and desperate. She knew no one had fed them while she was gone. She found the stairs cut into the cliff face, the uneven narrow stone steps leading down from the garden. Iriel took the velvet pouch beneath the neck of her robe and began to ascend. The gargoyles continued their screaming. She knew the vampire must have heard them by now. Suddenly she saw him. He stood at the garden's edge, at the head of the stairs, fists upon his hips as he watched her. The paleness of him gleamed softly against the black-starred sky. One of his wings was hanging askew, she noticed suddenly, dangled awkwardly amid the rest. Iriel remembered the Darkangel's slow, limping retreat when last she had seen him. She realized he must have broken his pinion in the struggle with the pendulum. The Darkangel did not fly now, but let her come. She was too far from him yet to see his face. She studied her feet as she mounted the slick, unrailed steps. Instead, 1 stair, 2, 12, 20. She lost her count at 37. Then abruptly he stood before her. Iriel halted on the last top step. No more lay beyond. The vampire blocked her path into the garden. She stood barely a pace from him, not looking at him. Her pulse was pounding from the long, steep climb. The vampire said, "So you have come back." Iriel felt a dull surprise dart through her. His voice had lost its bell-like resonance. It sounded hollow now, grating. How could I ever have believed that voice beautiful, thought Iriel. The vampire demanded, "Why?" Iriel struggled to find her tongue. "I could not stay away," she managed at last. That was true enough. And she found that though she was yet very afraid of him, she was no longer powerless to answer him. He made a sound in his throat then that might have been acknowledgement, perhaps indifference or contempt. He said nothing for a moment, as if thinking, then drew breath suddenly. His words, when they came, sounded oddly agitated. "I knew you would return. All along I knew. That is why I did not bother to retrieve you from the pendulum when he so imprudently snatched you from me." She watched his white-fisted fingers clenching and struggling against his palms. "I might have brought you back any time I wished." His tone grew lighter, tighter, yet sounded at the same time strangely unsure. "But I knew you'd be back soon or late. I let you return of your own that you might see for yourself. No one may defy me." Iriel said nothing. She could taste the falseness of his words. It was cowardice that had caused him to give her up to the pendulum. So much she was able to see, even as she'd lain wounded along her rescuer's back. Iriel snorted very softly, stared at the Darkangel's feet, cowardice alone. He said nothing more. She dared not glance up to see, but he seemed to be looking at her, studying her. Suddenly he put his hands upon her shoulders, and her knees went weak. "If you kill me now—" She started in a rush. Her voice shook, but the words died on her lips when she raised her head to speak and beheld the Darkangel's face for the first time in many day-months. Strangely, it had no power over her. His eyes were the same colourless crystal as before, his complexion white as ash. The leaden necklace still circled his throat, but he was no longer fair to look upon. Across one cheek were the 4 long bloodless slashes the pendulum had dealt him. They had not healed in all this time. The left shoulder of his garment hung in ribbons, and through the rips she saw the white, unbleeding wounds of his flesh. He ignored her words, and she realized his gesture had not been intended as a threat. "You have grown, girl, since the last time I saw you." His tone was quieter now, almost curious. "You are no longer so bony. One may even tell you are a wench beneath that rag." The coldness of his palms numbed her shoulders. "And the sun," the vampire mused. "It's bleached your skin and hair. Perhaps the desert life agrees with you." He slid his hands upwards from her shoulders, and Iriel felt herself pale. Surely now he meant to strangle her. But he only placed his hands on either side of her face. Her cheeks stung with the chill. "I had not known you had such eyes," the Icarus was saying. "They are emerald. That is a rare colour for eyes." He had called them fig green once, thought Iriel. The Darkangel smiled, a coldly amused smile. "Do you know, I well believe you may be almost prettier now than was my last wife. She was a darksome thing, hair like black silk." Iriel closed her eyes at the thought of Edwin. "You were with her when I came upon her," the vampire said. "Ah, how I thought you ugly then." Iriel opened her eyes and shuddered, looking at his torn face. The slashes of his cheek gapped and seemed shut when he spoke. The vampire grew uneasy beneath her gaze and shifted his stance. "What are you staring at?" he muttered. Iriel felt a sudden inexplicable pity whelming up in her, like that she had felt when she first saw them, for the gargoyles and the wraiths. She did not realize she had reached up to touch the wounds until she saw her hand upon his cheek. "Do they hurt you?" she asked him. The vampire dropped his icy hands from her face, pulled away from her, and put his own fingers to the rends. "They burn," he snapped, half turned from her, The quietness had left his voice. "But my mother will mend them. I shall go to her tomorrow morning, and she will sew them up with a silver thread." He glanced sidelong at Ariel. "They will hardly show. The wing too." "They will not heal of themselves," began Ariel, before she remembered that without blood nothing heals. The Darkangel turned completely away. "No," his tone had soured. "It's a small price to pay for becoming an Icarus. My mother will put it to rights. Besides, if I never heal, I shall also never scar. I'm far too handsome to scar. My mother says I'm far too handsome to be allowed to scar." The feathers of his pinions ruffled and then smoothed into a dark cape as before. The one broken wing refused to settle. He stood fingering it. Ariel could not see his face. She put her hand slowly to the scar on her own neck, a double crescent of colourless tissue, became aware that in the same motion of the longer mark upon her forearm, now healed, they no longer pained her. It never occurred to her to be ashamed of them. The man told tales around the cook fires of winning of their scars. The Icarus had begun to pace. "By rights," he muttered, still fingering his injured pinion. His mood had darkened. "By rights, I ought to kill you now for having disobeyed me, run away, and dealt me these very slight damages." He drew a long breath evenly. "No less they have proved troublesome." His fingers tightened on the wing. "And the dreams, though they have passed." Ariel almost drew back a step as his sharp gaze glanced across her, until she remembered that she stood upon the precipice with no place to fall back upon except empty air. The Darkangel continued to eye her. "I could have killed you as you stood upon that mountain," he said harshly, "knife in hand, yet mercifully I spared you and brought you here." His white brow lowered dangerously above ice-coloured eyes. "Yet thus and thus you have repaid me." He touched his wounded wing and the slashes as he spoke. Ariel gazed at him, and as he paced there under her gaze, there was no splendour to him any more, no grace or majesty, only menace and vicious petulance. "He has no power over me," she realised. 6 months ago, I would have fallen at his feet. Her pulse had steadied since the climb. The warm wind from the plains was at her back. She held her ground beneath his glare. "If you kill me now," she found herself saying, then in a voice that did not shake, "who will weave your last bride's wedding sari?" It was what she'd faltered at saying before. The vampire stopped short. "A new bride," he murmured. "Yes." Her words seemed to have diverted his attention. He dropped his wing. "I must take a new wife soon, this very month." He was no longer looking at Ariel, and he gazed off across the garden. "And she shall be my final bride." The charms of his leaden necklace clinked as he nodded. "For a while, I shall go home and visit my mother and pay her just tribute. And when she's made me a true vampire," he smiled coldly, his voice grew velveted, "I shall join my 6 brothers and we shall divide up the world between us." The casualness of his assurance chilled her. "Oh, he is evil," she told herself, and longed to be away from him. "I must go and begin work at once," she told him, "if I am to complete the weaving of your bride's gown by nightfall." The vampire whirled, as if her unexpected words had made him suddenly aware of her again. She felt the wind of his whirling buffet her, and was conscious how easily with one swift sweep of wing or arm he might bat her back over the brink's edge to the plain far, far below. Watching him, his tightened lips and glaring eyes, for a moment she feared he might spring, but he subsided at last, breathing heavily. "Go then," he said abruptly. "Go and weave." Ariel stood gazing at him, knowing she ought to be thankful or surprised, and she was neither, only relieved. "You will let me live?" Now that he had finally granted it, she could think of nothing else to say. "For now," he snapped. "Until the morrow." His voice sounded oddly hollow. "Before I leave this castle in the morning, I shall strangle you." Ariel faced him and said nothing. refusing to let her heart quail. If the vampire was not dead by tomorrow's morn, she told herself, her life would be worth very little anyway. The Icarus turned from her impatiently and made a gesture of dismissal. "Begone!" Iriel left the top stone step, came forward into the garden, and started away from him through the wild flowering fruitless tangle. But as she went, she heard the rustle of wings as he turned again to view her. "Ah me," she heard him muttering, "girl, even your walk has changed. You move straight-shouldered as a princess now, no longer creep and cringe like a little slave." Iriel fought an impulse to hunch and hurry away and hide from his gaze, but she held to her pace and did not turn, for she feared that if she should so much as glance at him, he might call her back, and she did not trust his sudden quietness. It puzzled her. She could not make it out. He sighed then, as one might sigh over a lost trifle. "It will be a pity killing you." Iriel gave no sign that she'd heard. The softness of his words filled her with dread. She continued swiftly, steadily away from him across the garden and took to the steps down below into the caves. The Durrer was waiting for her at the base of the stairs with a rushlight in his hand. Iriel felt her heart lift now when she saw him. Her chill from the Darkangel began to abate. She felt a smile dawning upon her lips for the first time since she had left the Pendulon. The little man gave her a startled snort as he spotted her and fell back a pace. "Heavens, but you've grown, child," he told her as she reached the bottom step, "and not all of that up." Iriel gave a laugh and was surprised to find herself still capable of laughter. She brushed the tears from her cheeks. "I think perhaps that food laid into your magical pouch acquires magical properties, little mage of downwending." The Durrer blushed and looked down at his feet. "So they still remember me by that name," he sighed. Smiling, "I'll not deny I'm pleased." Iriel handed him the velvet pouch. "The Avaclon's hoof?" he asked. "The immortal one, mind you." "Good, good." He took the pouch from her and put it in his sleeve. "I'm glad you figured out that much from the rhyme. If only I'd been given a little more time for explanations." He glanced towards the ceiling as though aware the Darkangel stood in the garden above. Then he returned his gaze to Iriel. "I must say, though," he exclaimed, "you took your own dear time about returning. I was half afraid you had given up or else run home." Iriel shook her head and felt the scar again. "The vampire bit me. I was a long time healing." At that the Durrer blanched and held the rushlight high that he might see. He turned away, face drawn. "Daughter, daughter, I never meant that he should catch you. I sent word ahead." "The Pendulon saved me," she said, "and left me with kind people until I grew strong." The Durrer sighed, a little relieved. "Well, at least I know my magic has a bit of potence left. I was afraid the skiff would not transform, and then you'd be left stranded without the lion knowing." He shook his head and clucked and put his fingers together. "I thought at first, when you said the vampire bit you, that you meant he'd caught you and left you for dead. I knew that he fought with the Pendulon. His slashes in the wing were proof of that. But I began to fear the Leosol had come too late for the saving of you. You took such a time returning." He stopped himself, seemingly embarrassed at his own outpouring of words, and Iriel laughed again. "But enough of this!" He clapped his hands with a sudden vigour and became stern with himself. "For I have work to do, and so do you." He reached into the pouch and pulled the star hoof from it and stood gazing at it. "I must begin the brewing of a bridal cup, and you must make the gown." Then he halted again a moment and gazed earnestly at Iriel, and his voice grew quieter, as though even yet he could not believe it. "Truly, daughter, are you well?" She nodded, and the Durrer laughed, shaking his head. "Well, good then, so I think we best be off, the both of us." Then he hurried away down the shore along the river running. Iriel felt a final quiet laugh forming in her throat. He seemed a little in awe of her, and his sudden brusqueness was just to hide it. She turned and walked up the riverbank towards the steps that led to the castle. Leaving the light and warmth of the caves, she felt the chill of the vampire's keep descending upon her, but she shook it off. She'd resolved herself to the garden above, to have done with the helpless dread. There was not time for it, and she had weaving to attend to. When Ariel came to the room of the wraiths, they were much as she'd seen them when she had first come to the castle. They paced the floor, or sat rocking and moaning, or writhed and shrieked and tore their hair. They were all of them still thin as mummified birds. Their starved faces held only dark, eyeless hollows, and their hair hung stiff and brittle as nettle-seed silk. She still could tell none of them apart. The only difference was that the garments they wore were not the coarse drab things she had seen them in at first, but light and airy shifts, spun of charity. The wraiths saw her standing in the doorway all at once, and some of them gave a feeble cry. She went into the room among them, and they were all gathered around, and reached to touch her as though they could not believe she was really there. "You have come back," they said. "You have come back. You were gone for a long time. We called for you and called." The lethargy of their voices telling Ariel how pitifully their wits had dulled in her absence. "We grew so lonely with no one to talk to and sing us tales," they mumbled. Ariel bit her lip and let out her breath, and hoped she might, over the day-month's time, restore their faculties somewhat. "Why did you stay away so long?" pleaded the wraiths. "I ran away from the castle," said Ariel. "But he's caught you again and returned you," they moaned. She shook her head. "He caught me once, but at the last I got away." "Why did you return?" they cried, rousing. "If you escaped him?" Ariel smiled. Already their reason seemed to be quickening. "I only went because I had an errand to do, and now that is done, so I returned." "But it's madness!" cried the wraiths. "You were safe away from him. Why did you come back?" "I promised I'd help you," said Ariel. "I could not leave you stranded here to die." "We are grateful," said the wraiths, subsiding. They dropped their voices, glanced furtively about. "But you must hide. He will kill you if he finds you." "He knows I'm here," Ariel replied, taking up her spindle from the floor where she'd left it last. "And he means to kill me tomorrow." The wraiths began to moan again, but she soothed them. "Hush! Much may befall betwixt now and then." She sat down on the low stool amongst the wraiths and began to spin. She was months out of practice, but she'd not lost the knack. Immediately a golden thread sprang to her fingers and she let the turning spindle drop. She had a host of new learned desert tales to spin for them as well. "Now," she said, "now I'll tell you of my journey over the deserts and under the plain." Ariel spent much of her time with the wraiths, spinning the thread for the garment of the vampire's new bride and telling them stories of her sojourn in the desert and plain. She also went to see the gargoyles often. At first they were as starved and savage as before, but after she'd fed them they grew tame again, so docile in fact that though they still snapped and fought amongst themselves, some of them allowed her to caress them briefly, and a few would even take food from her hand. She fell to studying the silver leashes that held them to the tower, and she saw the chains were attached to each smooth brazen collar, not by means of a lock or even by a welded link, but rather by a slotted silver pin that might by the proper sequence of sliding and turning be slipped free. Nevertheless, though the weird beasts constantly tore at and worried their shackles, Ariel perceived that only a human hand could trip the bolts and unloose their chains. What time she did not spend with the wraiths and the gargoyles, she spent down in the caves with the Durra. He had converted the main treasury room into a sort of laboratory, a complex apparatus of slender metal tubes extended around the periphery with hardly a break, so that Ariel could scarcely get in the door. Many dusty old books lay open on the floor, though in the middle of the room there was still left considerable space, and at the very centre the little fire burned as usual, unflagging and undying. "Tell me," said Ariel, sitting beside the fire. "Tell me how this will help us kill the vampire." The little man bustled about the apparatus. He hurried over to a book to consult some diagram or formula. Then he hurried back to adjust the flame under one of his bubbling containers. Then he brushed off his hands and came to sit by the fire with Ariel. Out of this, he replied, gesturing at his handiwork, I shall distill the bridal cup. You mean to poison him? Ariel said quietly. Somehow she'd never before this brought herself to speculate what method they would use. It had not seemed real enough, but now the deed was imminent. Poison! So it was to be poison! It brought a bitterness into her mouth, knowing, but the Durrer was shaking his head. Daughter, he chided, the Darkangel is poisoned already. This cup is no harm to any living creature such as you or I, but to the vampire, well, what must I do? You must give it to the bride and have him drink it for a wedding toast. Do this when you attend her. By the way, how comes the spinning? The spinning is done, said Ariel, and the weaving will be by late afternoon. She glanced over at the Durrer's distillery. And the Icarus, she said, I have not seen him lately. Where is he? The Durrer rose and dusted his hands. He turned back towards the apparatus. He has flown, he answered. He flew at noon to find a bride. The little man paused a moment and glanced back over his shoulder at Ariel. And you, daughter? How are you bearing up? Still troubled dreams? She looked away and nodded. Sometimes. Her sleep was never free of the Darkangel now. Strange. When she'd been beneath his spell, she had never dreamed of him. Ariel rubbed her arms. When the Darkangel is dead, she murmured, more to herself than the mage, they will trouble me no more. She stood silent a moment, looking at nothing. Even now, she could not shake off the cold. It chills me to think what we're planning, she said. Across from her, Taub sighed and turned back to adjusting his tubes and vials. It chills me too, betimes, daughter, but would you rather accept the alternative? Ariel touched her throat and shook her head. No, no. She rose and shoved the thought from her mind. If they did not slay the Darkangel, their world would fall. She dropped her chafing arms and sighed. Well, if, as you say, the vampire is flown, I must go and set them free. The Durrer half turned. What's that? He said. What do you mean? The wraiths? Ariel shook her head. The gargoyles, she replied. I resolved to free them as soon as he was gone. The little man's brows drew together worriedly. Daughter, he will not be much pleased with that when he returns. Ariel sighed and shook herself. It makes no matter. To please him is no longer my great concern. She was a little surprised at the boldness of her words, even more surprised to find that they were true. The gargoyles suffer, and I shall free them. The Durrer looked at her, then in a very wonderment. 5 months of desert life, he said softly. Ah, mistress, how you are changed.